Welcome back, Knowledge Unbound. We're here. We are live, kind of recording the intro. Is that live? Well, we're live now. But it's
we
recording.
are live. Everything is recording this time. No take twos.
My
no take
producer
threes.
likes to forget hitting the record button.
In my defense, it was finals week.
Brought to you by the Rios Institute for Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. Special guest this week. Are bringing another Trinidadian. I don't know, Segev, I may have to ask you this. Maybe the listeners might pick up on this, but because he's Trinidadian, right? And this happens, I think, to most people who are immigrants. Is when you start speaking to somebody from your country, then your accent and your cadence gets a bit more like your original, right? As opposed to when I speak in the US, right? People could tell I'm not from here. But if I go back to Trinidad, you can tell that my accent has been bastardized a bit. But if I'm talking to another Trini, it gets more Trini. So I'm kind of curious because when I was interviewing him, I didn't really pay attention to it, but I'm kind of curious if that's what happened.
So I have spoken to several people who do speak French, Haitians that speak French, people from other places that speak French, like France, Canada, things of that nature. And I do realize that when I do speak French with Haitians, it does take on a more Haitian /accent /cadence, as you mentioned. Whereas
when you say French, you mean French or Creole?
French specifically.
Okay.
Haitian Creole, it's just one thing. It's just one thing.
Okay. I mean, that's what I thought.
Right.
Just wanted to make sure.
No, of course. But when it comes to French, because that language is not just spoken in Haiti.
Yeah.
There are differences, let's say when I speak to someone who is from Haiti that I've known for like X amount of time versus someone who's from insert name of European country that speaks French, who's one of the languages in French, basically.
Now. I mean, this was a real, another come circle moment for me, I think, because Leon and I met as undergraduates, right? I was at Morehouse College, he was at Claflin University, two historically black colleges. We used to attend the National Association of African American Honors Programs. I actually wonder if that group still exists. I hope they do. But we used to go, and there was a bunch of trainees who were there. I mean, other people, of course, too. But and so we kind of knew each other from there, and we went on. I don't think we were in touch for several years, but he's now a professor of management at Clayton State University in Georgia. Wrote a wonderful book with his wife, Dr. Simone Phipps. We talk about that, but we talk about a lot of other things, the lead up to this. And so in this episode, we're going to get into some history. We'll get into some Trinidadian stuff. We had a lot of fun. I think there's a lot to learn from this. Enjoy. Welcome to Knowledge Unbound. See you at the end. When I was at Morehouse College, I was part of the honors program. There was an annual conference called the National Association for African American Honors Programs. Highly specific, right? And so Morehouse always sent a set of representatives, and Claflin University always sent a set of representatives, which always had a bunch of Trinidadians, and so we connected through that. Leon, welcome to Knowledge Unbound.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. And that's a nice walk through memory lane.
I know, right? That was it. Like, I mean, at the time, obviously at that age, we're not thinking about 10, 15, 20 years from now, we might be professors, right? But it's kind of weird to transport yourself back in there. Or 1 year it was at Tennessee State. I remember that year.
Yes.
We all had our little presentations, and then we used to go on 1 year at Tennessee, we tried to find like the one Caribbean club.
Wow, I forgot about that.
Yeah. And your partner Kevin found some roti shop. Anyway, let's not do the whole thing about that. So Leon, all right, I kind of half introduced you. Why don't you tell people who you are?
Well, I'm Leon Prieto, originally from Point Fortin, Trinidad, which I like to say is the cultural capital of Trinidad and Tobago.
Mm-hmm.
So So growing up in Trinidad, it was a really good experience, you know. So went to school, secondary school back home, and I worked for a bit after secondary school. Then I decided, you know what, I need to transition into university life.
Before you continue, you say you tell people that it's the cultural capital of Trinidad and Tobago. Tell me more. And I'm a South boy too, you know that, right? So this is not a challenge. I just want you to articulate it.
Well, in Point Fortin, we have a number of calypsonians and soca artists and other cultural artists who really left a mark in the cultural landscape of Trinidad and Tobago. So people like the mighty Duke, he won the Calypso Monarch 4 years in a row. I don't think anybody ever done that. You know?
Didn't Marshall win like everything every time now? Like, it is.
But not consecutively.
Yeah, I know.
So Duke, mighty Duke, may he rest in peace. You know, so he was a legend. Got Luther, you know, another great calypsonian.
Oh, I didn't know Luther was from Point.
Yeah, he actually went to school with my dad.
Okay.
Primary school, I think. Then we have the legendary Super Blue. You know, he won so many soca monarchs.
Yeah.
If you ever listen to soca music, go to YouTube, type in Super Blue. You will see all of his songs, all of his performances.
Yeah.
So people like that. And then, you know, I grew up taking part in emancipation celebrations. So that was really big when I was a youngster growing up in Point Fortin. I would like to think that we started the emancipation celebrations in Trinidad, before, in Point Fortin, before it moved to Port of Spain. But it was a lot of culture, a lot of great experiences growing up in Point Fortin, hanging out with my friends, liming, as we'd say.
Yeah.
Making a cook here and there.
But one thing I share with people, Trinidad being colonized by so many different people and so many different immigration patterns, the names of places in Trinidad are so rich in terms of the history, right? So recently I was reading about Point Fortin was named after a French settler,
correct?
Right? Who before the oil was found in 1913, I believe, it was mostly sugarcane.
Yes.
Right. And his last name was Fortin. I guess in French you would pronounce it differently, but
yes, Forte.
Yeah, and then Vesini was also the name of somebody who had gotten land from the same guy, the same French guy in the Vesini area, also for land. Yeah, very, very interesting. Of course, 1913, all of that changed once they found oil.
Wonderful piece of history. And I actually went to school, secondary school in Vesini.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's some nice history right there, you know. So we have some rich history in Trinidad, but a lot of times we tend to not pay too much attention to it.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the oil industry. Trinidad is actually one of the oldest oil producing nations in the world, globally. When
you and I were in school, the figure that I was told is that at least at that time we were producing 0.5% of the world's oil, which, given the size of the country, is pretty ridiculous.
Yeah.
So you say you worked for a while after Vesini?
Yes, in the oil industry.
Oh, right.
Yeah. That's what we all did.
Yeah. Okay. It made sense, right? Okay. Well. You laugh, but I read a study somewhere where they were showing that countries that rely on natural resources as the primary driver of their economy, they did do worst on PISA, which is an international science test. And one of the reasons they were hypothesizing is that, well, you don't need to get a PhD to get a job. Like, you can go directly from secondary education to the workforce and actually live a pretty decently middle class lifestyle, because it was, it's a lot of oil, paid well. So what did you go and do?
Yeah, so as you just said, a lot of us, we weren't really thinking about getting a university degree. My whole objective was finish secondary school, get my subjects, and get a job in the oil company like my father and my grandfather. That's what we all did.
Yeah.
And a secondary school education was just enough for you to land a pretty good job and live a middle class or even upper middle class lifestyle.
Yeah.
So I had friends from the school. You went to Presentation College.
San Fernando. Well, I went there for Form 6.
For Form 6.
Yeah, I was in Hillview College in Tunapuna for the first 5 because my family moved around a lot. Yeah.
Okay.
But I was born in San Fernando.
San Fernando. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so a high school education was all you needed.
Right.
You know,
Right.
But times have changed now.
Yeah. So if you're in the oil industry, you're kind of following in your family's footsteps. It seemed like something. What triggered you to say, it's time to leave? It's time to do something else. Because a lot of people didn't do that, right? And you know that.
Yes.
So what triggered you to say like it's time to go?
And I'll keep it real. It was a bad boss.
Yeah.
Yeah, bad situation on the job. So I was always ambitious. So I started off from the ground up working as a security officer with the oil company. And my goal was to transfer to the environmental health and safety department.
Okay.
And I was successful in getting the transfer, but some of these bosses, these corporals and some of these bosses of mine, they decided, you know what, we're going to block the transfer of me and a few others who applied, and we were left in limbo. So they didn't roster us to work in the security department, and they blocked us from moving to that job in the health and safety department. So we were out of work for maybe 6 to 8 months, and I needed to find time.
This is what year?
This was around either 90, maybe 99.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
around 1999. Yeah, so it gave me a lot of free time to study for my SATs.
but was the SATs always something you had planned to do, or did this situation say like, I need to look beyond Trinidad?
The situation definitely accelerated the ambition. I wasn't really taking it too seriously before, but
okay.
But the loss of income and then some of the bad situations I dealt with, being in limbo,
right,
not making an income at all. It pretty much forced me to get serious. That was the kick in the pants I needed. Because
the funny thing is, this is not a scientific study, right? But a lot of people I know, like you and I, who left Trinidad to come to the US to study, it's not like we sat down at 17, 18 and say, it would be a great thing to push our minds and go No, I was chasing after a girl. I had a girl. And in fact, I only applied to schools in Chicago because that's where she was. And ironically, she ended up going back to Trinidad. Anyway, that's a long story. But obviously, it worked out, right? So you took SATs, and how did Claflin become top of your list?
Well, my mom, I think I got a lot of my ambition from her. She found out about this SAT prep class in San Fernando, where you from. And I took this class, and the beautiful thing about that prep class, they told us a lot about the different universities that offered full scholarships, and Claflin was one of them.
So it wasn't just to prep for the SAT, it was the whole process.
Exactly, because I never heard of Claflin University. Morehouse, I heard of. Howard, I heard of, but Claflin, never heard of it. So I applied, and they gave me a full scholarship. The rest is history.
Yeah, I tell people ask me about Morehouse, and Americans, God bless their soul, a lot of times assume that I went because, the big history and its prominence. I'm like, no, they gave me a full scholarship. This was an economic decision.
Yes.
Tuition, room and board. Okay, I'll see you Monday. So how was life at Claflin?
Claflin was a beautiful experience. My roommate from college, we are still best friends today. He's an South Carolinian from Columbia, South Carolina.
Yeah.
We had nothing in common. We argued all the time, but we became best of friends. And then plus, we learned a lot about each other's cultures. And there were a lot of Trinidadians, West Africans, and of course Americans from different parts of the country, not just the South. So it was a beautiful melting pot. And then plus I was part of the Alice Carson Tisdale Honors College. And Mrs. Tisdale, may she rest in peace.
She did 2 years ago?
Yes, I think it's 2 years ago. Yeah, she did such a good job creating a powerful learning experience for all of our honor students, and it left a mark on me up to this day.
Yeah.
So Clapton is beautiful.
You know, let me, and we're going to get into some of your professional work in a while, but I want to stop on this for a second because, you know, I'm working on a project with a good friend and colleague, Peter Felton, who's written a lot about relationship-rich education. and he's written a couple books on that, him and Leo Lambert and some others. And one of the things we talk about is in the moment, like when you are a student, you enjoy the experience, and maybe on some level you recognize that this is somebody who genuinely cares for you. But the real power and depth of what's happening, it doesn't really resonate until you're 45. You know, like right? Like when you look back and you think about what you got from that experience, it doesn't compare to the impact you felt at the time. And I find that interesting because I could even think back at those same National Association of African American Honors Programs conferences and watching the Claflin group. And it's not that we didn't have relationships at Morehouse, right? Dr. Jocelyn Jackson was great, one of my favorite professors of all time. But you could just see the unity in your group and the way her strength and the way she would, you know, cajole but without disrespecting, right? And in witnessing that, you're seeing somebody who is not just trying to keep you all in line, but teaching you lessons along the way.
Oh, yeah.
And it's such a lost part of education and what it could be. And you know, I guess I think it's just really powerful to hear an alumnus, like articulating that.
Oh, yes, she definitely scolded us, you know, but it came from a place of love, you know. So, and she saw something in me I didn't see in myself.
Right.
And, you know, so she played such a transformational role in the lives of myself and many others. So she's missed daily. But Claflin, you know, that whole experience was just powerful. And as you said, when we reflect 20 years later, it's like, wow, we took so much for granted. But at the same time, you know, I made sure that I lived in the moment as well. And I understood, even back then, that I was getting a rich educational experience at Claflin. And the relationships, they still stand today. I have a lot of great friends. And I went back for homecoming last year. Even the chief of security, he remembered me. I was like,
really?
Oh, my goodness. I was like, I used to have hair back then. Now I'm bald and, you know, a little more weight on.
You and me both. Man. Yeah, there was the days for hair follicles are now. Rear view mirror.
Yes.
Well, I also remember some of your colleagues when you were at Claflin, and I say this out of respect, this is just what they told me, that they would call Orangeburg Boringburg. So therefore, you know, you kind of leaned into each other because there wasn't a whole lot to do in the community. So were you a business major at Claflin?
Yes, it didn't start off that way. I started off computer science, and that experiment lasted 1 week.
Is it even fair to call it an experiment for that length of time? That sounds more like a pass. You walk past the building.
Man, some of those classes, I was like, okay. Because I used to love video games back home, and I had this...
Not the same. The same.
Totally not the same at all. You know, but I told myself, you know what, do something practical. So I studied management. And but as you were saying, yes, Orangeburg was Boringburg, but it forced us to really lean into each other and get to really know each other better. And a lot of the international students, we forged such deep bonds. And thankfully, South Carolina State was right next door. So
really?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yes. We shared a fence. That's it.
Oh, okay.
So there was always, it's like 2 campuses for the price of 1. And
so there was freedom of movement because Spelman College was next to Morehouse.
Yes.
But it was not freedom of movement. I tell you that right. Oh, boy. Yeah, you had very specific visitation hours. Yeah, it was a whole interesting deal. But
there was freedom of movement. And we were even free to take classes at South Carolina State and vice versa. And then there were always Trini parties every other weekend.
Okay. I didn't realize it was
soccer matches. You know, we call it football. So soccer matches every so often. So it was a fun time.
Okay.
Fun time.
where it was, so after that was Georgia Southern, I think.
Totally different experience at Georgia Southern.
Okay.
Yes, that's where I went after.
I don't know my Georgia geography very well.
Yeah, Statesboro, Georgia.
Okay.
So it's like, that's like a hour north of Savannah. And Georgia Southern was a little bit of a culture shock because, leaving Trinidad and heading to an HBCU, the culture shock isn't that profound. But Statesboro, Georgia, it was a bit different.
Yeah.
So I got a full ride to do my MBA there. And I experienced some good old-fashioned racism
Really?
in Statesboro. But, the experience, it just made me stronger.
Right.
It just made me stronger. But the school itself, it was a great school. It's still a great school. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to earn my master's there. But Statesboro was a challenge. And this was from 2004 to 2006. Yeah, so, but let's hope things have improved in Statesboro.
We'll keep our fingers crossed on that.
Yeah.
So a lot of people who get their MBAs then go on to work in the business world. You chose to get your PhD. Why?
Well, after my MBA, I worked for a little bit. I decided to move to the New York area, so I worked a little bit there. And then I moved back home for maybe 6 to 7 months. So I worked with a National Energy Skills Center in Trinidad. And the goal of that organization was to equip people to work in the energy sector. So I always had this passion for human resource development, education, be it vocational or tertiary education. So that experience really solidified my decision. You know what? I'm going to get my PhD in human resource and leadership development.
Okay.
So I did that work before I went to LSU and studied human resource and leadership development.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I know so many Trinidadians, well, internationals really, who school here, go back home for a while, and, that then sort of, for different reasons, you decide to come back and, get the terminal degree. Let's pivot a little bit. So you wrote a wonderful book called African American Management History. It's won several awards, been mentioned a ton. I thoroughly enjoyed it. You wrote that book with Dr. Simone Phipps.
Yes.
Want to make sure we mention that, who you're married to. So a lot of nepotism. Who spell checks who is the question.
Simone does a spell check.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about that project. What made you take that on? What was the inspiration? And what it's been like promoting that discussion on the worldwide circuit?
Well, I have to take this all the way back to Trinidad.
Okay.
I always loved history.
Yeah.
I studied history in secondary school. I did A-level history, which is the equivalent of AP classes. So I took a advanced history back home. So I was always fascinated about our ancestral knowledge and history and all these things. So when I moved to the U.S., I played with the idea of studying history, but I was like, you know what? I'm an immigrant. Let me do something practical and get a job. So my desire for history, it never really went away, but I tried to figure out ways to integrate it in my work. So when I did my PhD, one of the classes I took, one of the doctoral classes I took was a management history doctoral course. And I was like, wow, this is something. This is a thing.
Right.
And so I learned about the history of management, the history of enterprises. But I noticed something was missing. So there was hardly any representation from, African Americans, Latino Americans, or any other histories of management or enterprise from different parts of the world. So I was like, this may be an opportunity.
This is in the textbooks you're talking about.
Yes, in the textbooks. And even when I was a business student at an HBCU, all we learned was the business theories and philosophies from Europeans and Anglo-Americans. You know, so the only thing we would hear about during Black History Month was Madam C.J. Walker.
You have a whole chapter on Madam C.J. Walker, right?
Yes, I have a chapter on Madam C.J. Walker and the woman who actually gave Madam C.J. Walker her start in business, Annie Turnbull Malone. You know, but she's usually overlooked in a number of the narratives, you know. So I just figured, you know what? I attended an HBCU and I felt that the business curriculum from an African-American perspective was a bit lacking. But we learned a lot of Black history at Claflin. But when it came to business, it was a little bit lacking. And I decided when I finished my PhD that Simon and I, you know, we both decided we got to write a book to address this gap in the literature.
Yeah.
You know, so we decided to take a stab at it, and we were able to find a number of resources, and we dug through the archives, and we found a lot of rich thought leadership from African Americans who made a contribution within their own communities and who gave advice on how to start these businesses, not just to make a profit, but also to make a meaningful difference within their communities. And that's one thing we saw within these Black business pioneers. They were social entrepreneurs.
Right. Yeah, that was a big theme for me as I was reading the book. And I want to maybe bring up one example. So you talked about Ubuntu, which... interesting thing with Ubuntu, well, a couple of things with that, right? Many places I read about Ubuntu as a concept is that it doesn't really have a direct English translation, right? It's a philosophy, it has a meaning, right? And I'm actually reading a book on philosophy right now where they discuss it as I am because we are, right? So it's very much tying the quality of your existence to everybody else's thriving, which stands opposed to Descartes, I think, therefore I am, right? Like it's kind of the polar opposite of that. And so you discuss Ubuntu in this book with this sort of cooperative model. So I guess I would like you to kind of, elaborate on that, because I would think that most people, myself included, like when you think of business in the Western, ideology, it's to maximize utility, maximize profit, satisfy shareholders, that kind of social piece tends to go missing. And so tell me a little bit about the genesis of that and then how it impacted the ways in which people thought about starting businesses in the African-American community.
Well, you got the definition correct with Ubuntu. It's kind of hard to define, but, a proxy is I am because we are, as you said. So it's all about humanness, humanity. And we see echoes of that philosophy in many parts of Africa, West Africa, other parts of Southern Africa. And this philosophy, it survived the Middle Passage into the Americas, right? So even growing up in Trinidad, we participated in many African traditions without realizing
without knowing,
Yeah, like Susu.
Like Susu, right?
Susu means...
Please tell my audience what Susu is.
Susu, it's quite common in West Africa. It's like a rotational savings and credits association, but it's informal.
Right.
And you join it based on trust. People have to know you,
right,
to ensure that you're going to pay your weekly or monthly hand on time, right?
Right. So the kind of high level explanation is everybody gives, let's say, $50 a month.
Yes.
And every month it's somebody's turn to collect the hand.
Exactly.
And so what they collect is the gathering of all the money. So essentially, at some point, your month will come, and you will get that. Do you know what Susu means, like directly translates to?
That I never found the definition of it, and that's some homework I need to do. But the Susu, it's practiced all over the Caribbean. You may have different names, so in Jamaica they call it partner.
Mm-hmm. Oh, really?
Yeah. In Guyana, they call it box hand.
Mm-hmm.
In Kenya, they call it chama.
Okay.
But Nigeria and Ghana, they call it susu for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And I saved money with a susu. I bought my plane ticket to the U.S. with the hand I collected, with the payout I collected from my susu.
Mm-hmm.
So that was an African tradition. Another one with African and indigenous roots was gayap, which means lend a hand. And this is like a type of community activity where neighbors may get together to help a neighbor finish their incomplete home.
Okay.
So if somebody is trying to transition their home from board to concrete, so we would, on a Saturday morning, we would mix cement and lay bricks and help these neighbors finish their home. And usually we would get a reward, which might be a plate of pilau, which is, I guess, the Trinidadian version of, what do they call that Spanish dish again?
Paella?
Paella.
But not really, because paella is like seafood based, right?
It depends on
and
what...
does paella have coconut milk in it?
Well, that would make ours special. Well, paella, is very dependent on location in Spain. The original paella was made of the rabbit in Valencia.
Oh, did not know that. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But after Gayap, we would get some pilau. But, we would always do it just for the fun of it and just to help a neighbor out.
Right.
So we would see these cooperative systems manifest in many parts of the Americas, United States included.
Uh-huh.
So...
in the African American communities mainly, or beyond that?
Well, you will see it throughout the African diaspora, including the African American community. And even W.E.B. Du Bois, he saw this, he noticed this, and he even wrote about it. And he was a big proponent of cooperatives and the need for African Americans to draw into or tap in to the cooperative spirit that always existed within the community, and to formally form these cooperatives and turn it into businesses, and so we could help each other and perform a different type of capitalism.
Yeah, I have to confess, I was surprised when I read that part, when you brought that up in the book, because the Du Bois I grew up knowing is the talented 10th Du Bois, which was always contrasted very starkly with the Booker T. Washington, cast your bucket where you are, right? So, of course, no person is just one thing. So I understood to a certain extent there was more to him than this one thing a lot of people knew him for. But it was interesting knowing that he articulated for this type of thing.
Oh yeah. Even I was surprised,
right,
because my impression of Du Bois entering college, I was like, oh, this guy, he's an elitist. Because I heard of the talented 10th and everything.
Yeah.
And then on the other extreme, people would look at Booker T. Washington. They would cast him as, an Uncle Tom. But by looking at them in such a myopic view, we fail to understand the complexity of their works and their contributions.
Right.
And they both, even though they're always cast as opponents, they both wanted the same thing.
Right.
They wanted to see the upliftment of African Americans and people of African descent throughout the world, actually. Because they both, their works and their philosophies, it transcended the African American community, and it impacted the entire diaspora, and even the continent itself. So Du Bois, he even wrote a book. He did some research when he was a professor at Clark Atlanta called Negroes in Business. And he studied a lot of the black businessmen and businesswomen throughout the United States. And Booker T. Washington observed all of the great work he was doing, and he decided, you know what, let me operationalize this research from Du Bois.
Oh, interesting.
And he created an organization called the National Negro Business League, which is still in operation today. So the research of Du Bois helped Booker T. Washington.
Yeah.
And that National Negro Business League, it was a powerful institution that really helped African Americans when it came to sharing knowledge in terms of best business practices and so forth, So they both complemented each other.
Right. Let me ask you this question about the sort of cooperative mindset, right? And I was just thinking about this as I was reading the book. People in the American context, so people are here and you have black communities opening businesses successfully with this kind of social entrepreneurship approach. Was some of that forced, though, in the sense that if you have to do business where there's abject segregation, right? You kind of have to rely on each other.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're not going to get, at that time, you're not going to get white customers. And so you're depending on each other. And so almost by definition, if it's going to make any money, if it's going to stay in business, right? There's also that as a force that is driving the cooperation.
Yeah.
Did you kind of trouble that? Like how much was sort of the historical influence, but how much was just a function of the time that you're in where you have to rely on each other?
I didn't get too deep into that, but you raise a very important point because even if a black business owner was a selfish individualist,
right,
you had no choice but to lend a hand and look out for your community in order for your own business survival. Because those were troubling times, and some will argue we still live in troubling times, but back then, especially during the days of Jim Crow, you had to look out for each other, and you had to have a cooperative mindset in order to be successful as a business owner. You had no choice,
right?
So a lot of black business owners saw the business necessity of adding that social component. So even one of the pioneers I wrote about in the book, Charles Clinton Spaulding, he wrote that we need social service in business as one of his tenets of ways to be a successful entrepreneur. So that social component was very important. And he wrote about that in 1937, long before social entrepreneurship and social innovation became buzzwords.
Right.
He was talking about the need for social service in business. So he saw that and he understood that. And any smart black business owner really leaned into that and manifested that in the way they ran their businesses.
Right. Well, one of the reasons I asked you is because I'm happy for somebody listening to fact check me on this, but I think according to the book Black Miami, Marvin Dunn, one of the first black communities in Miami is called Overtown. And the decline of Overtown as a thriving business community happened post-segregation because once black community members had options of where to shop, they would continue to shop in Overtown, but they would also go elsewhere. But white residents of Miami would not come to Overtown. So the businesses that were thriving really suffered, right? And it obviously we want segregation not to happen, but it was an interesting consequence of that change. Is that something you know of in other places?
Yeah, that happened all throughout the United States, so, a lot of times, people were very happy with that added freedom to go as they please and shop where they like. But so many of us, many African Americans at that time stopped patronizing a number of the black businesses. And as you rightly mentioned, a lot of the white Americans didn't really shop at some of these black Wall Streets throughout the United States. So places like Overtown, as you mentioned, places like
Lippitt Hill in Providence,
Bronzeville in Chicago, and Durham, North Carolina, and even Winston-Salem had a thriving black community. They even had their own bus line that was very sophisticated, quite large. It was like what do they call the bus company? It was like a black. Is it Peter Pan? There's this bus company that used to exist called Peter Pan. It pretty much was a huge bus company, but as soon as segregation ended, folks decided, you know what? Let's travel with the white buses. And, that black bus company in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, it went away.
Yeah.
So I guess in the exuberance to really celebrate this newfound freedom, we kind of forgot our own businesses. And it's sad to see that was a consequence of the ending of segregation. It's pretty sad that many of these businesses disappeared.
Right. So let me ask you about how this book was received and its impact, because it sounds to me like your project is twofold. One was to unearth and make explicit contributions of the Black diaspora to how we could think about businesses, right? That is not currently being discussed in many textbooks, many classrooms. So it's a rediscovery project. The second goal, though, is to draw from the thinking, the things that you've unearthed, the things that you've articulated so well in this book, to have that impact and infect the thinking of how people think about businesses in general, right? So you said social innovation is a buzzword, but it's been discussed, for almost a century. For that second piece, right? How have those discussions been, right? Getting current business schools, business classrooms, business owners even to be thinking about social innovation and social entrepreneurship.
It has been received quite well. So I'm happy to say that Morehouse, they adopted.
Morehouse?
Yeah, exactly.
I had to slip that in.
Yeah,
Sorry.
your alma mater. By all means. Yeah, so there's a class at Morehouse. It's called the Black Entrepreneurial Mindset. And they adopted a book, and so they teach about the different philosophies discussed in the book. And you even have schools like University of Cambridge. They utilize the book in their business school. So they have a social innovation program at Cambridge, and I'm a research fellow there. So they use the book there. And University of Exeter in the UK, they have a class on the history of Black entrepreneurship. So they discuss some of these ideas in some of these classes. And I even saw for-profit companies like Deloitte retweet some of my articles related to cooperative advantage and the ways to make a lovelier capitalism, a better form of capitalism. And I was quite surprised to see some of these companies even paying attention to some of these ideas. So it has transcended.
Well, tell me more about that. I want to hear more about when you say pay attention to the ideas or talking about a lovelier version of capitalism. I would love to hear what that looks like, because I think we're all struggling a little bit, right?
Yeah.
I'm not anti-capital. I'm not getting into that debate, but certainly there are some issues with it. I think what you are writing about can help us fix or look at. So what are people meaning when they say that?
Well, let me go back to the source. So Adam Smith, he's credited as the godfather of modern day capitalism. A Scottish economist, philosopher, professor. And he's also the epitome of absent-minded professor, but that's for another podcast. But Adam Smith, he's well known for his book, The Wealth of Nations. And most people, they remember conversations on profit and self-interest and the invisible hand, etc.
Right.
And many of the things, they tend to take it out of context, or they focus in a very myopic way on those few terms or buzzwords. But prior to The Wealth of Nations, he wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Okay.
And in that book, he talked about the need for self-interest to be balanced with empathy. He called it sympathy towards others, which is empathy today, as the missing piece of that puzzle. So a lot of times today, we get the self-interest part down-packed.
Yeah.
We are experts at self-interest.
Yeah, we have that. Check.
Exactly. The empathy part, is what's really missing. And
so why do you think that book, I'm really curious, why do you think that book is not as well known?
that's the $1 million question. And it's actually the more, I would say, more thoughtful book, you know. And I think if he was alive today and you ask him which book he would like to be remembered by, it'll be the first one. The Theory of
Why
Moral
do you think
Sentiments.
you'll say that?
Because it got to the essence of humanity and who we are as people.
Okay.
You know, it's more
Yeah.
introspective, you know, and he even had this line in the book that man has a desire not just to be loved, but to be lovely. So he wrote that with this whole concept of empathy and all these things in mind, and that we are here on this planet not just to make profits or focus on our self-interest. We need to display sympathy towards others, as he would put it, but empathy today. You know, we are human beings, and it goes back to this whole philosophy of Ubuntu, which means humanity. So I think he would even be drawn to this whole concept of humanity and of Ubuntu, even though, you know, there are some scholars, when they did their research on Adam Smith, he used to disparage, I guess, different cultures in the global South, you know, typical ignorance of that point in time.
Yeah.
But if he really did take the time to learn about these different philosophies in the global South, meaning Africa and different parts of Asia, etc., he would see that there are many philosophies in those parts of the world that really reflect the type of ways we as human beings should learn to live and thrive together. You know, that empathy part is key. And human beings, we are very innovative, very creative. We can adapt well. So I think we have the potential to figure out this empathy component, you know, to make capitalism lovelier.
Okay. That's interesting because, and I'm going to buy that book after this because I'm really curious. Without having read it, it almost sounds a little, not contradictory, but to Wealth of Nations. I'm just, as somebody who's read both, obviously, like when you juxtapose the two pieces of work, do you see contradictions in the two, or do you see maybe a failure to marry the two streams of thought? Because to me, what sounds like would be beautiful if you wanted lovelier capitalism is to take this, explicit focus on humanity with this system, this economic system you're proposing, right? And explain to us, what does that look like in totality?
Yeah, so the two books, at times it may contradict each other, but I'm not sure what was his motivation to write The Wealth of Nations. Maybe he saw an opportunity, for book sales. I'm not sure.
Tenure, anyone?
It's possible. It's possible. But some of the things we tend to focus on in Wealth of Nations, us as readers, especially those who really love Adam Smith, they tend to take his words out of context and they focus on a couple of the buzzwords.
Right.
Like the whole self-interest and profit. Because he talked about other things as well. And there were still flashes from his previous work in Wealth of Nations. But because, a lot of us are trying to grow businesses and make profits and all these things, they focus on what they want to see.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to profess my ignorance here, but do you think Keynesian economics is an attempt to marry the two, in that there is a role for a Leviathan that cares for its people and invests resources in that, versus like kind of a Milton Friedman mindset where capitalism is the be all and end all of. I know I'm giving a very simplistic interpretation, but just given the discussion on empathy and capitalism, that those are the two theoretical opposing things that come to mind.
You mentioned Friedman.
I did.
Oh gosh. He has his proponents and his fans, and and he was one of those economists who was a very articulate, charismatic speaker, so he won other people over with his way of thinking. But this whole myopic focus on just profit and self-interest, we have to really ask ourselves this question: where has it taken us?
Right.
Where has this version of economics taken us as a civilization? Where many of us are looking at Mars as, okay, maybe we can live there if we mess things up on Earth. So there's something I think that's very wrong. Something
right.
that can be improved. So I strongly believe that we will wake up.
Yeah.
And there are some of us who are already very much cognizant of what's really happening around us and are actively trying to make a difference. So many voices are being drowned out now, of course. But we just need to find a way to let people know that there's another way for us to live within this capitalistic economic system. And capitalism as we know it is not how it should be according to the source material.
Or could be, right?
Or could be,
yeah.
as you said. So there are different approaches to economics and capitalism, of course. But one thing I do know, we have to become more human-centered.
Yeah.
And that's the only way for us to thrive and survive as a species.
Yeah, I mean, I've been having this conversation about humanism being human-centered a lot in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, and math spaces. The stereotype there is we are the worst when it comes to that. But it's really heartening actually to hear you bring this up and making this push, and knowing that this is a thing that the business community and academia are looking at. And so what I'm curious about, in one of the things I love about the book is exactly that, right? It's focused on humanism. It's thinking about the social piece. I'm thinking now about Dr. Prieto as a professor. When you're teaching in class, when you're teaching elements of your book, I'm curious about the conversations you're having with your students as future business leaders, future academics, future consumers, voters, whatever. How is their response, I should say? How is their response to you bringing up this conversation that entrepreneurship, I think I haven't said that word correctly one time this whole podcast, but that's okay. That business ownership, going into business, kind of can have this social innovation element. What are those conversations like?
To be honest with you, most of the students, they are shocked that they were black business pioneers other than Madam C.J. Walker.
So you have to get past that first before you even...
Exactly. And they always seem very fascinated about the different type of capitalism that was practiced by some of these pioneers. And so some of the classes I teach, not just face-to-face, online as well. And I received many thoughtful comments, especially from my online students. And they seem very surprised by it, but and they get inspired by it, actually. They're like, wow, we could actually practice a different form of capitalism. We can actually be business owners who can really make a difference within our communities. So I teach a social entrepreneurship class. And so they find it to be very refreshing because many of my students, and not just the traditional age students, of all ages, many people, they have this desire to see a better way of doing business, one that has that humanity injected into it. And then they would always bring these examples from what they experience, good and bad, and ways they think this country could go moving forward. So. But when we move past the Madam C.J. Walker thing, we have some rich conversations about it.
Yeah. I'll get you out of here on this last question. We talked a little bit about your Claflin experience and how special that was, and Miss Tisdale and her effect. But also, I'm just thinking back to Trinidad, right? So you and I, I'm a South boy too, reform. Like you, I worked 1 year in Scotiabank, by the way. I don't know if you knew that.
Okay.
Before I came up to Morehouse. And of course, at this point in our lives, I don't know if you've been doing the math, but we've spent more time in the US than we have.
Yes, I did the math.
Yeah. Oh, crazy. But I am still very, very influenced by my formative years in Trinidad. And one of the things I think about in the kind of work that I do is that I grew up in a very kind of Western European style socialized democracy, right? So there's parliamentary elections, there's voting, but there's a pretty big social safety net, right? Government healthcare, free schools, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not perfect. This is not my argument here, but it's when you spend so much of your life being a part of a system where you understand that you can build in care and you can build in empathy and you can build in, safety nets, while at the same time holding people accountable to work hard and do all those things. I think it did impact my thinking on how I approach my teaching, how I approach research, how I think about education. And without being too prescriptive here, it sounds like it may have played somewhat of a role in how you have come to think about what business education and business ownership and entrepreneurship can be. Is that a link that you've made in your head, like thinking back to Leon of Vestany High School and Point Fortin and the way you think about the world and your career now?
Absolutely. So I may have been living in the U.S. for how many years now?
Don't tell them.
For the listening audience, I moved here when I was 3 years old. I was a prodigy. But anyway, but yes, Trinidad and Tobago played a tremendous role in how I view the world, of course. You can't really separate the two, pretty much, So it definitely shaped my thinking about a number of different things. And I would like the listening audience to realize that there are many things we can learn from the global South. Be it Trinidad, be it India, be it many other countries. There are a number of things we can learn from each other, and Trinidad is not perfect by any means, right? But I definitely appreciated the free education, tertiary education, the free healthcare, and things like that, And there's some things Trinidad can learn from the U.S. as well, because we have some, we have our national watchwords, which is discipline, production, and tolerance. Right now, I think it's just words right now. It just,
well, the P in particular. Right?
Exactly. We need to operationalize it in a real way more, So there are things we can learn from each other. Right. So instead of just judging different nations, judging each other, there are many things we can learn from each other, So, but America is still a young country in the grand scheme of things, and there are ways to go.
Yeah.
And I know some folks might be a bit alarmed with certain things that are happening right now, but I believe this country can self-actualize,
right?
And with my Trinidadian background, I believe you and we have something to offer as well. So that's why we have to keep on doing the work that we are doing,
right.
Which is informed by our past. I'm a big believer in Sankofa, which means go back and get it.
Yeah,
You know, we got to
yeah.
return to the source and try to chart a powerful future for ourselves, you know, way forward.
Yeah.
You know, but all credit to Fanny Village Government School. That's my elementary school.
In Point Fortin, right?
In Point Fortin, in Fanny Village, Point Fortin.
When last you went back?
It's been a while. You know, the pandemic slowed down my travel. And then I started a family in the midst of the pandemic. So I haven't been home in quite a while. But this year, plan to make a trip back home.
Okay. Well, the highway now reach all the way to Point now.
Yes.
So
it's a short trip.
It's a much quicker ride than it was when you and I were trying to go through those bad roads in Library.
Exactly.
and Penal they could never fix it. So
exactly.
It's quite nice. I mean, I'm glad you brought up Sankofa. It's a word I encountered when I went to Ghana several years ago, and the context within which they were using it was this notion that, you know, the slaves who were taken from the West Africa, once they left the door of no return, that was it. That was the group that is responsible for the Black diaspora in the Western Hemisphere, right? And so now that we're in a different time, there's been some pretty major movements to get people to come back, not necessarily to live per se, but to come back and, you know, you have a right to return home. So to go back and get it in that context is to go back and claim your history and claim who you are. Leon, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, man. Take care. Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for a racially just, inclusive, open STEM education. We are graciously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Our guest today, Dr. Leon Prieto, Professor of Management at Clayton State University. Our producer, Mr. Segev Amasai. Segev, did I code switch?
Well, just a little bit. It's funny you mentioned that because code switching, well, I didn't know about that until my very first class at FIU, which was in spring 2021, by the way. I was just a starry-eyed 20-year-old just wondering what this entire college thing was. And here we are. I like to think of code switching as a very personal experience because I'm also from the Caribbean. I speak 4 languages, English,
Way to
Creole.
just slip that in there, thanks.
Yeah. And things do change a little bit depending on who I'm around, whether it's someone from Haiti or from the US or from
Well, and I think that's part of Leon's journey. Again, like me, grew up in Trinidad, came here for college. Interesting the circumstances that led him to come. But as you sort of find your path right through higher ed as an immigrant, as a student in college, you almost kind of never know what you're going to fall into. So because he actually started off as a computer science major, right? And that switch, and we talk about students leaving STEM and we posit it as a bad thing, but in his case, he kind of found something that look, this is where his passions were. Also loved how much he brought in history in the discussion, and maybe my bias is the way I think about education and education research is how much we can learn from our past. Anyway, it's one of those episodes that's kind of hard to summarize because there's just so much in it. But I want to invite listeners, to the same kind of critical mindset he has toward his teaching, his research, and how he wants us to think about not just business and business management, but also teaching. I hope we take that criticality to ourselves and our lives moving forward. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Please be excellent to each other.
Man has a desire not just to be loved, but to be lovely. So he wrote that with this whole concept of empathy and all these things in mind, and that we are here on this planet not just to make profits or focus on our self-interest. We need to display sympathy towards others, as he would put it, but empathy today. We are human beings, and it goes back to this whole philosophy of Ubuntu, which means humanity. So I think he would even be drawn to this whole concept of humanity. we just need to find a way to let people know that there's another way for us to live within this capitalistic economic system. And capitalism as we know it is not how it should be according to the source material.
Or could be, right?
Or could be,
Yeah.
as you said. You know, so there are different approaches to economics and capitalism, of course. But one thing I do know, we have to become more human-centered.
Yeah.
You know, so and that's the only way for us to thrive and survive as a species.
In this life we go be, enjoyment you go meet, happily you go live, forever I promise. Baba is